This is the sermon for April 17th, Easter 2022. And I'll be reading from John 20, 1 through 18. Early in the morning of the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. She ran to Simon Peter and the other disciple and said, "They have taken Jesus' body from the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." Peter and the other disciple left to go to the tomb. They didn't understand yet the scripture that Jesus must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to the place where they were staying. Mary stood outside near the tomb, crying. As she cried, she bent down to look into the tomb. She saw two angels dressed in white seated where the body of Jesus had been, one at the head and one at the foot. The angels asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" She replied, "They have taken away my master, and I don't know where they've put him." As soon as she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she replied, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabbi," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Don't hold on to me, for I haven't yet ascended. Go to my brothers and sisters and tell them, I'm going up to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene left and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." Then she told them what he said to her. Well, grief is the appropriate response after the death of a loved one. There are many types of grief. There's anticipatory grief before the death happens. We're getting ready, but it's still a shock when the death happens. I saw that over and over again in hospice. People thought they were ready for the death, and then the weeping came even much more after the death. There's grief and sadness. There's grief and depression. Those are slightly different. And there's stuck grief when it goes on years and years and years and it doesn't seem to change. Grief is always in motion, and so it lessens, it increases. We build a new life around the hole in our life where the loved one used to be. And so in that sense, grief is changing. In another sense, it isn't changing. And our task is to build a life around the grief. And then it changes only in perspective to the new parts of our lives. There's also grief and resilience. And there's a wonderful book about grief and resilience. It was done by a researcher for herself after the death of her daughter in a sudden car accident. And I heard that on a podcast called Hidden Brain. It's wonderful, wonderful book. Well, the person that you loved has died and is no longer with you. That changes everything. Your awareness of having been loved is real. Your love is real. Your memories are significant. And all of that is true. And death means that everything has changed. So in teaching about grief, we understand it can take 1 to 3 years. You move through the process of all the significant milestones happening in a year, change of seasons, birthdays, anniversaries, significant events in the family. All of these things happen. And each time it feels like the grief is fresh. It's difficult. We need a lot of support when we go through this process. So Mary is in grief at the death of her beloved teacher. The death was not imagined. Jesus was not asleep. It wasn't a coma. It was a real death, and Mary is weeping. And on top of grief, she thinks that the gardener has removed the body, or that gardener will know who has removed the body. I always picture her trying to get the body from somewhere else and take it to the tomb and put it back and then do her administration of ointments and cloth and wrapping. I'm glad she didn't have to do that. So Jesus is there and calls her by name, a very beautiful moment. In many churches on Good Friday, they extinguish one candle at a time as the service goes on for Good Friday. And as they do that, it becomes darker and darker. And it's a way for people to recognize the sadness, the grief, and the finality of death in Good Friday. The disciples got to that first Easter in grief, and they had to work with that until they understood something different. And so I love that it was Mary who told the disciples about Jesus being alive again in resurrection, but not the same. I think John is very careful to portray Jesus as not going backward and not yet fully having gone forward. And my interest in resurrection and Easter is what is real in the here and now. You probably are tired of me talking about that, but I'm only interested in here and now because pie in the sky by and by, I have no idea what that will be. And I don't know how that changes our lives here and now. So I want to know about power in the here and now. The disciples, as they understood resurrection, began to understand that Jesus had tackled the powers of the world, political and religious and violent powers of the world. Rome, in fact, Jesus had tackled that, and the powers don't like to be challenged. And so they did everything they could to silence Jesus, including torturing and killing him. And what happens now if you confront Russia over what they're doing in Ukraine? The powers will try to silence you. What happened in our country when black people spoke the truth and they believed in the power of resurrection, and the powers silenced them or did everything they could to silence them? Did it silence the message forever? No, it didn't. There have always been destructive powers, powers of death and destruction, and truth is always spoken. Resurrection power has always spoken truth to power. And the disciples, after the resurrection, realize that they could have a new confidence in God's power here and now. Here and now for them, here and now for us. And so eventually, truth and the power of life will prevail over death and destruction, and we can be part of that. If you've concluded that evil will always win, you'll give up. You'll go about your life. You'll do what you want to do because what else is there? Live, avoid pain, gather pleasures until you die. That's all there is. And a lot of people live like that. As Christians, we can live in resurrection power, believing and working toward change for better in the world. People can get what they need for survival, but the powers won't often help them with that. And so it falls to people who believe in power of life over the power of death. The power of resurrection becomes apparent when we risk a life of faith. The disciples risked, they spoke truth to power, and eventually they were martyred, like Jesus was martyred for telling the truth. So, do you want to know how to find faith? It's living now as if we live in the presence of a living God. Do we have power in our lives for change now? Or do we live stuck in thinking this is all there is? That's the question. Faith is a leap. Christ took a bunch of fledgling and raggedy disciples. They failed him. They failed themselves. They failed their ideals. And they failed. They just failed. And Jesus took them, and they became a power in the world. And in fact, the suffering they endured, the deaths that they endured, And not only the disciples, but all of the early Christians, many of them suffered for their faith. And their witness was a testimony to the power of God. Are we missing that in some ways today? Some ways we have it. Some ways we show it to the world. I know we do. I know we do. But in some ways we're missing some of that resurrection power. So it's a matter of taking a risk to make a difference in the here and now. Some think of faith as mainly a spiritual experience for heaven. And a lot of people have criticized Christianity on that basis. That's another reason I'm not interested in pie in the sky by and by. I'm interested in what God is saying now for our work here and now. A lot of Christians think God is saying, let me get you out of this terrible, deadly, tearful world. Let me just rescue you. Oh, I love you so much. Let me rescue you. No, God is giving us courage for now. But resurrection power gives us the ability to believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Walter Wink, in Engaging the Powers, a book I read when I was in seminary, writes, Jesus at his crucifixion neither fights the darkness nor flees under cover of it, but goes with it, goes into the darkness. He enters the darkness freely, voluntarily. The darkness is not dispelled or illuminated. It remains a vast darkness, untamed and empty. But Jesus somehow encompasses it, and it becomes the darkness of God. This is difficult to wrap our minds around, but it's true. It's now possible to enter any darkness and trust God to wrest from it both meaning and resurrection. That's the key to resurrection power. I have not understood that a lot in my life, but I'm getting to it now more and more. And I want to close with this story. It happened on a bridge outside of Kansas City. And I don't know if this is true or not. I haven't Googled it to find out. It happened on a bridge outside of Kansas City. A man had lost all hope and had gotten out of his car, climbing onto the outer framework to jump to his death. He was determined to jump. Traffic stopped. 2 police officers arrived. One was strapping on a harness, the other one, and that one with the harness was attaching a rope to the squad car. And the other was talking to the man to try to keep him on the bridge until the harnessed officer could lower himself to where the man was. Eventually the man jumped, and the officer jumped right with him and caught him in midair. That's pretty amazing. And they went down to the end of the rope. The rope stopped them. He held on. The officer held on. I hope that the man held on too. I hope that the power of life kicked in for him. But the people, as they swung above the water and the rescue began to happen, the people could hear the officer yelling, "If you go, I go. I'm going to hold you as long as it takes." Well, God in resurrection power grabs us midair and holds us. And then we can offer that for others. That is the power of resurrection. It's hard, but it's worth it. Let's find out what God is calling us to beyond what we're already doing, and we're already doing a lot. Let's be affirmed. The power of resurrection is in our lives for all that we're already doing. May God bless us. Amen.